The cold water hit my face before I even realized everyone was looking at me. For a second, the ballroom went completely silent. Then came the laughter. Not from strangers. Not from people who barely knew me. It came from family, friends, and guests gathered to celebrate my son's wedding. Water dripped from my silver hair onto the navy blue dress I had spent weeks choosing for this special day. My mascara blurred slightly at the corners of my eyes. Across the dance floor, my daughter-in-law Olivia stood holding an empty decorative bucket, laughing so hard she had to wipe tears from her eyes. "Come on, Helen," she said loudly enough for half the room to hear. It was just a joke. More laughter followed. I turned slowly toward my son Daniel. I suppose a part of me still expected him to step forward, put an arm around my shoulders, or at least tell everyone the joke had gone too far. Instead, he smiled awkwardly and shrugged. "Mom, don't take it so seriously," he said. "We're just having fun. Just having fun." Those 4 words hurt more than the cold water. I stood there in the middle of a reception hall decorated with white roses and crystal chandeliers, feeling older than my 69 years. The guests began returning to their conversations. The band resumed playing. Servers continued carrying trays of appetizers as though nothing unusual had happened. Around me, life moved forward. Inside me, something stopped. I forced a smile. It wasn't difficult. Years of motherhood had taught me how to smile through disappointment. I smiled when bills piled up after my husband passed away. I smiled when Daniel left for college, even though the house suddenly felt empty. I smiled when Olivia slowly pushed me farther and farther from my son's life after they became engaged. So I smiled now. I thanked a concerned waitress who offered napkins. I excused myself calmly. Then I walked toward the ladies' room with as much dignity as I could manage while water soaked through my dress and shoes. The mirror reflected a woman trying very hard not to cry. I dabbed my face carefully and adjusted my necklace, the one that had belonged to my late husband Thomas. He had worn the matching wedding band for 42 years. Looking at my reflection, I could almost hear his voice telling me to hold my head high. So I did. 10 minutes later, I returned to the reception. Nobody apologized. Nobody asked whether I was all right. Olivia was already telling another story at her table, drawing attention like she always did. Daniel looked happier than I had seen him in months. Watching them together, I realized something uncomfortable. The water wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't an accident. And it certainly wasn't harmless. There had been intention behind it. Planning. A desire to embarrass me publicly while disguising cruelty as humor. The thought settled quietly into my mind. I took my seat and listened as guests toasted the newlyweds. I clapped when everyone else clapped. I smiled when everyone else smiled. But for the first time all day, I began paying attention. I noticed the glances Olivia exchanged with her bridesmaids. I noticed how several people seemed unsurprised by what had happened. I noticed Daniel avoiding eye contact whenever he looked in my direction. Something wasn't right. The water would dry. My dress could be cleaned. My pride would recover. But a question lingered long after the laughter faded. Why had Olivia wanted to humiliate me on the most important day of her life? At that moment, sitting beneath the glow of 1,000 wedding lights, I had no idea that the answer would lead me to a secret far bigger than a bucket of water, a secret that would change everything I thought I knew about my son, my daughter-in-law, and the wedding I had quietly helped make possible. I did not leave the reception early. That surprised even me. A younger version of myself might have gone home, changed clothes, and cried into a cup of tea. But age teaches you something valuable. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is stay in the room and pay attention. So I remained at my table near the back of the ballroom and watched. The evening unfolded beneath warm golden lights and expensive floral arrangements. Guests laughed, danced, and celebrated what appeared to be a perfect wedding. From a distance, Daniel and Olivia looked like the picture of happiness. Yet the longer I sat there, the more I noticed things that had escaped me before. Olivia was always at the center of every conversation. Every story somehow became about her. Every compliment found its way back to her. When guests approached me, she often appeared moments later, gently steering the discussion elsewhere. It was subtle. So subtle that I had spent years convincing myself it was unintentional. That evening, however, I began looking at everything through a different lens. Once you stop making excuses for someone, you start seeing clearly. As the band played another song, my mind drifted backward through the past 6 months. The engagement had been announced shortly before Christmas. I still remembered how excited I felt when Daniel called me. I had cried happy tears after hanging up the phone. My son was building a future with someone he loved. At least that was what I believed then. In the weeks that followed, wedding planning consumed their lives. Olivia often spoke about creating unforgettable memories. She wanted everything perfect. The venue, the flowers, the catering, the photography, the custom decorations. Whenever costs increased, Daniel would call sounding stressed. I never wanted him to worry. Quietly, I helped whenever I could. A deposit here, a vendor payment there, additional expenses that appeared unexpectedly. I never mentioned the full extent of my support because I did not want gratitude. I simply wanted my son to begin married life without financial pressure. Looking back now, I realized something uncomfortable. Olivia never once thanked me directly. Not once. There was always an assumption that support would be available, an expectation rather than appreciation. The realization settled heavily in my chest. Near the dance floor, Olivia laughed with several bridesmaids. One of them leaned close and whispered something. They all glanced toward me before quickly looking away. Perhaps it was innocent. Perhaps it was not. But after what had happened earlier, my instincts refused to dismiss it. Then another memory surfaced. 3 months before the wedding, I had asked whether Daniel wanted to wear his father's cufflinks during the ceremony. They had been in our family for decades. His father treasured them. Daniel seemed touched by the idea. Olivia immediately interrupted. She said the cufflinks did not match the wedding aesthetic. At the time, I smiled and accepted her decision. Sitting in that ballroom now, I wondered why so many decisions seemed to involve removing traces of our family's history. Another song ended. Guests applauded. The newlyweds kissed while cameras flashed around them. Everyone cheered. I clapped politely along with the crowd. Then my phone vibrated against my purse. I almost ignored it. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number. No name, no photo, just a local area code. Normally, I would have waited until morning. Something made me open the message. Attached was a short video file. Beneath it were only 7 words. I stared at the screen as my pulse quickened. The message read, "You deserve to know the truth." For several seconds, I simply looked at those words. Around me, the celebration continued. Glasses clinked. Music played. Laughter echoed across the ballroom. Yet suddenly all of it felt very far away. Because deep down, I knew that whatever was inside that video had something to do with the question that had been haunting me all evening. And for the first time, I suspected the humiliation I experienced that day had not been a joke at all. My fingers hovered over the video file for several seconds before I finally pressed play. The recording lasted less than a minute, yet it changed the entire evening. The camera angle suggested it had been filmed inside a meeting room several weeks before the wedding. Olivia stood near a table covered with planning documents and decoration samples. Around her were 3 bridesmaids and a wedding coordinator. At first, the conversation seemed harmless. They discussed seating arrangements, flower colors, and reception activities. Then one of the bridesmaids asked a question that made my stomach tighten. "Are you really going through with a surprise?" she asked. Olivia laughed. It was the same laugh I had heard earlier when everyone watched me standing there soaked and embarrassed. "Absolutely," she replied. "It is going to be hilarious." Another woman sounded uncertain. "Do you think Daniel's mom will be upset?" Olivia rolled her eyes dramatically. "She will survive. Besides, she always acts like she is the star of every family event. This wedding is about me." The room laughed. I felt my chest grow heavy as I watched. Then came the part that made me replay the video twice. Olivia pointed toward a decorative sketch on the table. "Make sure someone records it from the front angle," she said. "I want to post it later." The video ended there.
No explanation.
No context beyond what I had already seen. Yet it was enough. The incident had not been spontaneous. It had been discussed, planned, and coordinated in advance. Most painful of all, they wanted an audience. I lowered my phone slowly and stared across the ballroom. Olivia was smiling for photographs near the wedding cake. Guests surrounded her. Cameras flashed every few seconds. Looking at her now, I realized something I had spent years avoiding. She did not merely tolerate me. She resented me. The question was why. I slipped my phone back into my purse and tried to gather my thoughts. The answer should have made me angry. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Clarity has a way of replacing emotion. When confusion disappears, the truth often arrives quietly. Another vibration interrupted my thoughts. A second message had arrived from the same unknown number. This one contained only a sentence. "There's more. Check your email tomorrow." I read it 3 times. Whoever sent the video clearly knew details about the wedding. Perhaps they worked for the venue. Perhaps they were part of the bridal party. Perhaps they had simply witnessed something they could no longer ignore. Whatever the reason, they wanted me to see a side of Olivia that had remained hidden. Across the room, Daniel finally looked in my direction. For a brief moment, our eyes met. I expected guilt. Instead, I saw exhaustion. It caught me off guard. He looked tired. Not physically tired, but emotionally drained. The expression vanished almost immediately as another guest approached him. Yet the image lingered in my mind. Suddenly, a possibility occurred to me. What if Daniel did not know everything? What if he believed the afternoon's humiliation had been harmless fun? The thought did not excuse his behavior. He should have defended me regardless. Still, it opened a question I had not considered before. How much of what was happening had been orchestrated without his knowledge? As the evening continued, I found myself studying both of them carefully. Olivia controlled every interaction around her. She guided conversations, directed attention, managed perceptions. It was a talent almost. Meanwhile, Daniel seemed to move wherever she pointed him. Watching them together felt different now. Like seeing a familiar painting under brighter light. The picture had not changed. Only my ability to see it clearly had. And somewhere beneath the music, laughter, and celebration, a quiet feeling settled into my heart. The wedding day was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of one. The reception finally ended close to midnight. Guests gathered their coats, exchanged hugs, and drifted toward the parking lot beneath strings of soft white lights. I congratulated the newlyweds one last time before quietly making my way to my car. Olivia barely looked at me. Daniel hugged me briefly and thanked me for coming. The words sounded polite, almost rehearsed. During the 40-minute drive home, I kept thinking about the video. I replayed every second in my mind. The laughter, the planning, the certainty in Olivia's voice. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the exhaustion I felt had nothing to do with the late hour. My house greeted me with familiar silence. It had been that way since Thomas passed away 6 years earlier. I turned on the kitchen light, set down my purse, and poured myself a cup of chamomile tea. The clock on the microwave read 12:47 a.m. Normally, I would have gone straight to bed. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table staring out the window into the darkness. Some nights reveal truths that daylight hides. This felt like one of those nights. Memories began surfacing one after another. Moments I had dismissed. Conversations I had excused. Small incidents that now seemed connected. The first occurred shortly after Daniel introduced Olivia to the family. We were having dinner at my home. Thomas was still alive then. During the meal, he mentioned that Daniel had always wanted to learn how to manage investments. Before Daniel could answer, Olivia spoke for him. She said he was too busy to worry about finances and that she handled most important decisions already. Everyone laughed politely. At the time, I did too. Looking back, I remembered the brief expression on Daniel's face. He had seemed uncomfortable. Another memory followed. 2 years later, during a family barbecue, Daniel mentioned taking me to visit a coastal town I had always wanted to see. Olivia immediately changed the subject. The trip never happened. There was always a reason. Always a scheduling conflict. Always a better idea. One memory led to another until an uncomfortable pattern emerged. Olivia rarely argued openly. She did not need to. She operated through influence, through suggestions, through subtle redirections that eventually became decisions. The next morning, I woke after only a few hours of sleep. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen curtains while the coffee maker hummed softly. For a moment, I considered deleting the messages and moving on. It would have been easier, simpler, but the questions remained. Around 9 o'clock, I opened my email. There was a new message waiting. No subject line, no name, just an attachment and a short note. You paid for more than you realize. My heartbeat quickened. Attached was a scanned invoice from the wedding planner. I opened it carefully. At first glance, it appeared ordinary. Then I noticed highlighted sections. Several large payments had been marked. I recognized the amounts immediately because they came from my accounts. The floral arrangements, the venue deposit, the photographer, the live band. Altogether, the total exceeded what I believed I had contributed. Much more. Confused, I opened additional pages. The numbers continued. Line after line. Payment after payment. My hands tightened around the coffee mug. I had assumed Daniel and Olivia were covering a significant portion of the wedding expenses themselves. According to these documents, that assumption was wrong. Very wrong. I sat back slowly and stared at the figures. Suddenly, another realization surfaced. Daniel had never once discussed the final budget with me. Not once. Which meant one of two things was true. Either he genuinely did not know where much of the money came from, or someone had worked very hard to make sure he never asked. And for the first time since the wedding, I felt something stronger than sadness. I felt curiosity, because hidden somewhere beneath the receipts, secrets, and carefully managed appearances was a truth that had not yet fully revealed itself. For the next 2 days, I said nothing to anyone. Not to Daniel. Not to Olivia. Not even to my closest friend, Margaret. I spent those days doing something I had not done in years. I listened. I reviewed every document that had been sent to me. I organized receipts, invoices, and bank statements across my dining room table. Page by page, a clearer picture began to emerge. The wedding expenses had been far more extensive than I realized. Some payments had been made directly from accounts I controlled. Others had been routed through family trusts established years earlier by Thomas and me. Trusts that Daniel knew existed, but rarely discussed. What troubled me was not the money itself. I had never regretted helping my son. What troubled me was the secrecy surrounding it. Someone had worked very hard to make certain I remained unaware of the full story. On the third morning, another message arrived from the same unknown sender. This time there was no attachment, only a phone number and a short sentence. She thinks you still do not know. I stared at those words for a long moment before deciding to call. The number belonged to a woman named Rachel. She introduced herself as an assistant who had worked with one of the wedding vendors. Her voice sounded nervous. More than once she asked whether I was alone. When I assured her I was, she finally explained why she contacted me. Several weeks before the wedding, Rachel had attended a planning meeting. During that meeting, she overheard conversations that made her uncomfortable. At first she ignored them. Then she witnessed the incident at the reception and realized it had not been spontaneous. I felt guilty, she admitted quietly. You seem like a kind person. I thanked her for her honesty and asked what exactly she had heard. There was a brief silence before she answered. Olivia talked about you a lot. Something about the way she said it made my stomach tighten. Rachel explained that Olivia often described me as an obstacle. Someone standing between her and complete control over family finances. At first, I thought Rachel must be exaggerating. Then she mentioned details that only someone present could know. Olivia believed I maintained authority over several trust accounts and future distributions. She apparently worried that I might influence how assets were eventually handled. I sat quietly while Rachel spoke. The room seemed strangely still around me. Suddenly many things began making sense. The dismissive comments, the subtle insults, the effort to minimize my role in family events. It was never truly personal. At least not entirely. It was strategic. Olivia had convinced herself that I represented something standing in her way. Before ending the call, Rachel shared one final detail. It was the detail I could not stop thinking about afterward. Several months earlier, Olivia had reportedly told someone, "Once everything is finally under our control, things will be much easier." Our control. Not Daniel's. Not the family's. Ours. After the call ended, I walked slowly to the living room and stood beside the framed photograph of Thomas that sat on the bookshelf. He smiled back exactly as he had the day the picture was taken 20 years earlier. Calm, steady, wise. For a long time, I simply looked at him. Then I began to smile. Not because I was happy. Not because the situation amused me. I smiled because for the first time since the wedding, I understood the game being played around me. More importantly, I understood something Olivia did not. She believed the story was about money. She believed control came from access to accounts, trusts, and future inheritances. What she failed to understand was that the most important decisions had never belonged to her. And very soon, I intended to remind everyone exactly who still held the keys to those decisions. The following week, I scheduled a meeting with Richard Hayes, the attorney who had worked with Thomas and me for more than 20 years. Richard knew our family history almost as well as we did. He had helped establish trusts, prepare estate documents, and organize long-term plans that Thomas insisted would protect future generations. When I arrived at his office, he greeted me warmly and immediately noticed something was different. "You look determined," he said as we sat down. I smiled slightly. I think I finally understand what has been happening. For the next hour, I shared everything. The video, the anonymous messages, the invoices, Rachel's phone call. Richard listened carefully, without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands and stared thoughtfully at the documents spread across his desk. "Helen," he said finally, "there is something important you need to remember." He opened a file cabinet and removed a thick folder. I recognized it immediately. It contained the original trust agreements Thomas and I had created years earlier. Richard placed the folder between us and opened it. Page after page revealed details I had not reviewed in a long time. Many provisions remained exactly as Thomas intended. Certain distributions required trustee approval. Certain benefits could be adjusted. Certain privileges depended on responsible conduct and family cooperation. None of this had seemed significant to me before. Now it felt very different. Richard looked directly at me. "The assumptions being made about these assets are not entirely accurate." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" He turned several pages and pointed towards specific sections. The structure was more complex than most family members understood. Control did not automatically transfer the way many people assumed. Oversight remained in place for good reason. Thomas had worried that future generations might value money more than relationships. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Sitting in Richard's office, I realized he had been remarkably perceptive. As we reviewed everything, another surprising detail emerged. Several requests had been made during the previous year for information about trust distributions. Not by Daniel, by Olivia. She had apparently contacted administrative offices multiple times, seeking clarification about future benefits. Nothing inappropriate had occurred. The information provided was limited and fully compliant with policy. Still, the pattern was revealing. She had been asking questions long before the wedding. Long before the humiliation at the reception. Long before I received anonymous messages. I felt neither anger nor satisfaction. Only understanding. The pieces were finally fitting together. Before leaving, I asked Richard a simple question. If someone believes they know the entire picture, but they only understand part of it, what happens? He smiled. Eventually, reality catches up with assumptions. The answer stayed with me throughout the drive home. That evening, I sat on my back porch watching the sunset paint the sky shades of orange and gold. My phone buzzed once. A message from Daniel appeared. It was the first communication he had initiated since the wedding. "Hope you are doing well, Mom. Olivia and I are settling in. We should get together soon." I read the message twice. It sounded normal. Friendly, even. yet something about it felt distant, as though he were speaking through a carefully constructed wall. For a moment, I considered telling him everything immediately. The video, the documents, the conversations. Instead, I typed a short reply. I would like that. Then I set the phone aside. Some truths reveal themselves best when people believe they are completely comfortable. And for the first time since the wedding, I had stopped reacting. I had started preparing. Somewhere ahead, a conversation was coming. One that would force assumptions into the light. One that would reveal who truly understood the value of family and who merely understood the value of what family could provide. Until then, I intended to remain patient. After all, patience had become my greatest advantage, and nobody seemed to realize it yet. 3 days later, Daniel called and invited me to dinner at their new house. His voice sounded cheerful, almost relieved. It was as if he believed life had returned to normal after the wedding. I accepted immediately. The moment I hung up, I knew this dinner would tell me more than any document ever could. On Friday evening, I drove across town just as the sun was beginning to set. The neighborhood was beautiful. Tree-lined streets, fresh landscaping, large homes with wide front porches. It was exactly the kind of place young couples dreamed about when they imagined their future. Olivia greeted me at the door with surprising warmth. She hugged me lightly and complimented my blouse. If I had not known everything I knew, I might have believed her friendliness was genuine. Daniel appeared moments later carrying a tray of drinks. For the first half hour, everything felt strangely pleasant. We talked about the honeymoon, the house, future travel plans, work, friends, normal subjects, safe subjects. Yet beneath the surface, I noticed something familiar. Olivia controlled the rhythm of every conversation. Whenever Daniel began discussing finances or future plans, she gently redirected the topic elsewhere. Not abruptly, not obviously, just enough to steer the conversation where she wanted it to go. Watching her was like watching an experienced driver making tiny adjustments to a steering wheel. Most passengers never noticed. I did. During dinner, another detail caught my attention. Daniel mentioned that they hoped to renovate the kitchen within the next year. Before I could respond, Olivia smiled and said, "We are trying to think long-term, building equity, making smart decisions, planning for the future." The words themselves were harmless, yet something about the way she said them felt rehearsed. Then came the moment that changed everything. Olivia set down her wine glass and looked directly at me. "You know," she said casually, "Daniel and I have been talking about how important family planning is. It must be comforting knowing everything is already organized for future generations." The statement hung in the air. Daniel continued eating without reacting. Apparently, he saw nothing unusual about the comment. I smiled politely. "Organization certainly helps." Olivia nodded. "Thomas was very thoughtful about those things, from what I understand." There it was. Not a direct question. Not a request. A probe. A fishing line dropped quietly into deep water. I answered carefully. "Your father-in-law believed responsibility mattered more than money." For the first time all evening, Olivia seemed slightly uncomfortable. The expression lasted less than a second before disappearing. But I saw it. After dinner, Daniel stepped outside to answer a work call. Olivia and I remained alone in the kitchen. The silence felt different now. More honest. She leaned against the counter and smiled. "Daniel worries about you sometimes." I looked at her. "Does he?" "Of course. You spend a lot of time alone." Her tone remained pleasant. Families change. Eventually, everyone has to focus on their own household. The words sounded innocent enough, yet I understood the message hidden underneath them. She wanted distance, separation, independence from any influence I still possessed. What fascinated me was her confidence. She genuinely believed she understood the entire landscape. She believed every important piece was already in place. As I prepared to leave later that evening, Daniel walked me to my car. For a moment, it felt like old times. Just mother and son standing beneath a quiet night sky. Then he surprised me. "Mom," he said softly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." He hesitated. "Have you been happy lately?" The question caught me completely off guard. I studied his face. He looked sincere, concerned even. Suddenly, I realized something important. Daniel was not asking about money. He was not asking about trusts or inheritances or family plans. He was asking about me. And in that moment, I became more certain than ever that the story unfolding around us was larger than he realized. Much larger. After leaving Daniel and Olivia's house that night, I drove home with a strange mixture of sadness and hope. For weeks, I had focused almost entirely on Olivia. Her actions, her motivations, her assumptions. Yet Daniel's question lingered in my mind. Have you been happy lately? It was not the question of a man obsessed with money. It was the question of a son who sensed something was wrong but could not quite identify what it was. The following morning, I received another message from the anonymous sender. By now, I had stopped wondering whether the messages would continue. Instead, I found myself wondering what truth would arrive next. This time there was only a single attachment. A screenshot. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. Then I noticed the date. The screenshot had been captured several months before the wedding. It showed part of a group conversation between Olivia and two bridesmaids. Most of the exchange was harmless. Discussions about decorations,
Seating charts,
dresses. Then my eyes landed on a sentence that made me pause. One bridesmaid had asked whether the prank was really necessary. Olivia responded almost immediately. People need to understand their place eventually. I read the sentence 3 times. Not because it was cruel. Cruelty no longer surprised me. What struck me was the mindset behind it. The certainty. The belief that relationships existed within a hierarchy she controlled. As I sat at my kitchen table studying the screenshot, another realization surfaced. The wedding incident had never been about humor. It had never been about embarrassment. It had been a public demonstration, a message, an attempt to redefine positions within the family. Suddenly, everything felt simpler. When people feel secure, they rarely need public displays. They do not need audiences. They do not need humiliation disguised as entertainment. Those tactics belong to people trying to establish power. Later that afternoon, I met Margaret for lunch. She had been my closest friend for nearly 30 years and possessed the rare ability to tell uncomfortable truths without sounding judgmental. After listening carefully to everything that had happened, she stirred her iced tea and smiled softly. "You know what I find interesting?" she asked. "What?" "You keep talking about what Olivia believes. But you have not spent much time talking about what Daniel believes." Her observation stopped me cold. Margaret was right. I had assumed Daniel was either unaware or manipulated. But assumptions, even kind ones, were still assumptions. On the drive home, I replayed recent conversations in my head. The wedding, the dinner invitation, the question outside his house. Little details began connecting in ways I had not considered before. That evening, I made a decision. Instead of waiting for answers to arrive through anonymous messages, I would create an opportunity to hear directly from the people involved. The following day, I called Daniel and invited him and Olivia to dinner the next weekend. Nothing formal, just family. He accepted immediately. Olivia sounded enthusiastic in the background. That alone told me something. Whatever concerns she had about me, she clearly believed the situation remained under control. As I ended the call, my gaze drifted toward a large envelope resting on my desk. Inside were copies of documents Richard had prepared. Not accusations, not punishments, simply facts. Clear, organized, verifiable facts. I had no intention of creating conflict. But for the first time in a very long while, I was no longer interested in avoiding it either. Because sometimes the most revealing conversations happen when everyone arrives expecting one kind of evening and discovers something entirely different waiting for them. The evening arrived faster than I expected. I spent the afternoon preparing a simple dinner. Nothing extravagant. Roast chicken, vegetables, fresh bread, and the apple pie Daniel had loved since childhood. The house looked warm and welcoming, just as it had for decades. By 6 o'clock, everything was ready. The large envelope remained on the dining room sideboard exactly where I had placed it earlier that morning. I did not hide it. I did not display it either. It simply waited. At 6:15, Daniel and Olivia arrived carrying a bottle of wine and smiling as though this were any ordinary family dinner. For the first hour, it almost was. We talked about work, travel plans, and home improvement projects. Olivia appeared relaxed. Daniel seemed genuinely happy. Watching them together, I understood how easy it would have been to continue pretending. Families do it every day. They ignore uncomfortable truths because facing them feels too difficult. But eventually, every family reaches a moment when silence becomes more dangerous than honesty. That moment arrived over dessert. Daniel complimented the pie and smiled. "It feels good being back here, Mom." I nodded and took a slow sip of coffee. Then I stood and walked toward the sideboard. The room became very quiet when I returned carrying the envelope. Olivia's eyes immediately followed it. I noticed because she tried very hard to hide her interest. "There is something I want both of you to see," I said calmly. Daniel looked confused. Olivia smiled politely. I removed several documents and placed them on the table. The first was a summary of wedding expenses. The second contained copies of payment records. The third outlined trust structures and oversight provisions. Neither of them spoke at first. They simply stared. Finally, Daniel looked up. "What is all this?" I met his eyes. The truth. He studied the pages again. Slowly, confusion gave way to surprise. Then surprise became disbelief. "Mom," he said quietly, "you paid for all of this?" I nodded. "Most of it." The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Daniel continued turning pages. The numbers spoke for themselves. Across the table, Olivia remained unusually still. Her expression never fully changed, but the confidence I had seen for months seemed to fade little by little. "I thought we paid a much larger share ourselves," Daniel admitted. "That is what I believed you thought," I replied gently. He looked toward Olivia. For the first time all evening, she had no immediate response. Eventually, she cleared her throat and said, "We all contributed in different ways." It was not an answer. Daniel seemed to recognize that. Then I placed one final item on the table. The screenshot. The message. The evidence showing that what happened at the wedding had been planned in advance. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Daniel read everything twice. When he finally lifted his head, the disappointment in his eyes was unmistakable. Not anger, not outrage. Disappointment. Olivia attempted to explain. She called it harmless. A misunderstanding. A joke that had gotten out of hand. I listened, without interrupting. When she finished, I simply asked one question. "If it had happened to your mother, would you still call it a joke?" The room fell silent again. This time nobody rushed to fill it. Daniel looked down at the table. Olivia looked toward the window. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the backyard. Finally, I gathered the documents and returned them to the envelope. "I did not invite you here to punish anyone," I said. "I invited you because families deserve honesty." Daniel's eyes filled with regret. Olivia said nothing at all. As they prepared to leave later that night, Daniel hugged me longer than usual. Neither of us spoke. We did not need to. Some lessons arrive through arguments. Others arrive through facts. And as I watched their car disappear down the street, I realized something important. The water had dried weeks ago. The embarrassment had faded. But the truth had finally surfaced. And unlike water, the truth has a way of leaving a mark that does not disappear.